In this video, we shall examine our first of three cases of elite party building in late 19th century Latin America. The Chilean Radical Party was the largest and best organized party in Chile during the first half of the 20th century, and I will have much more to say about this party later on in this series. But in this video, I'm going to focus on its early decades, and on the series of events that prompted this political movement to develop its first formal party organization. While the Radical Party would later become firmly identified as the party of the Chilean middle class, it actually originated as the political vehicle for some of the wealthiest men in Chile. The Radical Party first developed around two pairs of brothers from upper-class families, Manuel Antonio and Guillermo Mata, and Pedro León and Ángel Custodio Gallo. The Mata and Gallo brothers were first cousins of each other on their mother's side, and one of their other mutual first cousins also happened to be the wife of the conservative president Manuel Montt. The Chilean elite at this time is a very small and interrelated circle, and these families occupy some of the highest rungs of that elite. Despite their family ties to the conservative president's wife, the Mata and Gallo brothers end up pretty firmly in the liberal opposition by the mid-1850s. And then in 1857, even the Conservative Party breaks from President Montt over disagreements about the relationship between church and state. A new civil war breaks out at the beginning of 1859 when the opposition attempts to overthrow Montt. While the Mata brothers and Ángel Custodio Gallo are arrested in Santiago and deported to Europe, Pedro León Gallo distinguishes himself as the most successful military leader for the rebel forces, and he holds out for several months before he is ultimately defeated by the government and sent into exile. The failure of this 1859 revolution causes Chile's opposition elite to reevaluate whether partisan revolutions are still a viable path to power in Chile. If the success of a partisan revolution were simply a matter of raw numbers, then the opposition really should have won this conflict. By 1859, all of the major institutions of Chilean society were lined up against Manuel Montt's government. He was opposed by most of the country's wealthiest landowners, by the provincial elite in both the north and the south, by popular organizations in the cities, and even by the Catholic Church. But Montt still commanded the Chilean army, and this enabled him to put down the rebellion with very little difficulty. In the aftermath of this failed revolution of 1859, most of the opposition concludes that the Chilean state is now too strong for any partisan revolution to succeed. No elite group ever attempts to stage a partisan revolution in Chile again, and opposition elites across the ideological spectrum now begin to focus on winning elections instead. In 1862, the next president issues a general amnesty, and the Mata and Gallo brothers are able to return from exile. But they find that the political terrain in Chile has shifted dramatically during their exile in Europe. Manuel Montt's term in the presidency has already ended, and the new president, José Joaquín Pérez, has broken from Montt's government, and he has aligned himself with the liberal and conservative opposition, elevating both parties into the government. The Mata and Gallo brothers do not want anything to do with this new bipartisan coalition government. They are staunch liberals, but they hate the idea that their party is now in bed with their ideological opponent, the conservatives. And so the brothers join together with some of their friends, and they form a dissident wing of the Liberal Party that was known at the time as the Radical Liberals or the Red Liberals. In the next congressional election in 1864, they challenged the liberal-conservative political machine in several of the districts, winning seats in a couple of them. In order to bolster their campaigns against the incumbent political machine's election interference, the radical liberal elite also founds a network of local party organizations called assemblies. The radical assemblies were responsible for nominating opposition candidates for Congress, mostly as a way to legitimize the campaigns of elite men who already planned on running anyway. The assemblies would also draft and approve the candidates' platforms, and they would perform campaign work for opposition candidates that they nominated, such as distributing ballots to voters and protecting opposition voters on the way to the polls. The early radical assemblies were primarily electoral organizations, and most of them stopped meeting as soon as the election campaign was over. But the radical liberal elite found other ways to maintain their social ties with the mostly middle-class assembly activists in between elections. The radical liberal politicians helped establish a variety of civic organizations that helped hold the radical social network together. The most important of these organizations was the Volunteer Firemen's Corps in Santiago, which was strongly associated with the radical liberal movement. Another important institution in this regard was the Freemasons. Nearly all of the major elite figures in the early radical liberal movement were Masons. And while the lodge meetings themselves are nonpartisan, the radical liberal elites are still able to leverage the social networks formed within the Mason community to recruit like-minded activists into their political movement. During the late 19th century, this movement comes to be known by the phrase Radical Mason y Bombero, radical Freemason and fireman, implying that the overlap between these three social networks is now so great that they are practically all just the same group of people. Anyone who belongs to one can safely be assumed to belong to the others as well. By the early 1870s, the radicals stopped describing themselves as the left wing of the Liberal Party, and they start to think of themselves as a separate political party that is now challenging the mainstream Liberal Party from the left. The Radical Party does not yet have any formal national level organization by this time. It is still mostly just a network of local assemblies and elite politicians who are led by Manuel Antonio Matta. But within the span of around a decade, the radicals have developed a distinct partisan identity. They have stopped identifying as liberals, and they now see their radical party as a political party in its own right. The Liberal-Conservative coalition government collapses in 1874, and the Conservatives withdraw from the government. And now the Radical Party faces a difficult choice. Should they reintegrate back into the Liberal Party now that the Conservatives are out of the picture? Or should they remain an independent opposition party? In the end, the party's leader Manuel Antonio Matta opts for a middle path. The Radical Party will join the governing coalition as a separate party. This decision to cooperate with the Liberals is extremely controversial within the young Radical Party, and it leads many of the party's leading figures to desert the party for good. The decision was made at a time when most of the radical assemblies were not very active, so the rank and file assembly activists did not play any role in this decision. And according to Pedro León Gallo, even most of the radical politicians in Congress were never really consulted. However, Matta is able to extract a really important concession from the Liberal government, an electoral reform that addresses many of the Radical Party's main institutional demands. This reform decentralizes the election process by putting it under the control of municipal governments rather than the national government, and it bars civil servants from overseeing elections. The reform also expands suffrage in Chile slightly by eliminating the property requirement for voting, though it still maintained a literacy requirement that continued to exclude most lower-class Chileans from electoral participation. The Radical Party's results in the next three elections appeared to vindicate Matta's strategy of cooperating with the Liberal government, and radical representation in Congress roughly doubles after the reform is passed. But then things start to go downhill for the party during the late 1880s. The radicals withdraw from the governing coalition, and then in 1888, the party suffers its worst electoral defeat yet. One reason for this decline is that the party's local organizations, the assemblies, are no longer as active as they were in the 1860s. Many of the party's middle-class activists have grown disillusioned in the Radical Party now that it is in government, and the politicians themselves have stopped investing resources in maintaining the assemblies. But an even more important reason why the party's representation in Congress is now collapsing during the 1880s is because the 1874 electoral reform left the incumbent president with a variety of tools for interfering in elections, and that election interference is now being directed against the Radical Party once again. In the mid-1880s, the future Liberal president José Manuel Balmaceda launches an unsuccessful attempt to reunify the Liberal Party under his leadership. And he becomes pretty annoyed at the Radicals when they insist on remaining a separate party. Upon becoming president, Balmaceda works to unseat as many radical politicians as possible, mostly in order to punish them for refusing to rejoin the Liberal Party. And so the radical politicians now face the full brunt of the government's election interference and the Liberal political machine. However, the Radical Party's electoral disaster in 1888 ends up giving the party the jolt that it needs to get better organized. Later that year, the Radical Party holds its first national convention in order to discuss how to rebuild the party following this election defeat. And most of the convention delegates agree that the party needs some major organizational changes if it is going to survive. The party's current organization as a loose alliance of candidates and local assemblies just isn't going to cut it anymore. The party needs official national level bodies that unite the party as a whole, such as a national convention that convenes once every couple of years, and a party directory called the Executive Council, which would lead the party in between conventions. But by far the most important decision that the delegates make is about how these different sectors of the party will tie together. The delegates decide to put the radical assemblies at the center of everything. From now on, the assemblies are responsible for electing the executive council, sending delegates to the conventions, and nominating all of the party's candidates. And because the assemblies themselves are comprised of ordinary, primarily middle-class voters, this makes the post-1888 Radical Party an unusually internally democratic party for this era. Very few elite parties worldwide gave their activists this much voice in the party's internal politics in the late 19th century. These organizational reforms revitalized the party assemblies over the following years. The assemblies ceased to be short-lived campaign organizations, and by the early 20th century, they had become largely autonomous party organizations that remained mobilized year-round. Over the next few decades, the party's network of assemblies expands to encompass most of the small towns and villages scattered throughout Chile. And in most cases, the assemblies created during this era are now being founded in a bottom-up manner. Local groups of political activists recognize that the Radical Party is an organization in which people like them can wield a substantial influence, and they found party assemblies of their own in order to take part in the Radical Party's politics. As more middle-class voters enter the electorate, they tend to flock to the Radical Party in particular. And by the 1920s, the Radicals had become the largest party in Chile's multi-party system. In 1924, the party wins over a third of its seats in Congress, surpassing both the Liberal and Conservative parties. The Radical Party does not really owe this success to the popularity of its policy platform or national leaders, but rather to the strength and inclusivity of its party organization after 1888. The Radical Party was the first party in Chile to develop a party organization that ordinary people actually wanted to join and participate in. And this gave the radicals a huge advantage over their rivals in recruiting party activists and incorporating newly enfranchised voters into their ranks.